John chapter 19 is one of those crux chapters, and I use the word crux advisedly because it comes from the word cross. It is the crucifixion, it is the time where sin is slain and death itself is faced up to by the author of life himself. We are really familiar with the whole crucifixion scene, I suppose, almost too familiar, I would suggest at times. And so it's good to read this again and again and to reimagine it. And it's useful to see it portrayed on screen for us in a new and fresh way because it's easy to get complacent about this. We thought about the fact that Jesus is the king incognito, the king in disguise. And you just see as Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd, he says, Ecce homo, here is the man. And it's a very famous painting, the Ecce homo. Here is the man, and here is the man. Here is the man who is the pinnacle of humanity. And as he stands there as a broken man, a man who has got a purple robe around him, a crown of thorns pressing into his temple, blood streaming down. He's been beaten and he's been punched. And this is what we do to each other. Interestingly, later on, Pilate also says, here is your king. And we know the mocking behind that, but here is how you treat the king. And this is what Jesus experienced, the king incognito. And maybe because I'm really familiar with the cross, I almost lose some of the horror of it at times. But one thing that really struck me, it's in this passage. It's in verse 3 when the soldiers have taken Jesus away. Pilate, it says, took Jesus and had him flogged. So he's been flogged with those 39 lashes really severely. And then the soldiers twist a crown of thorns and put it on his head, put on a purple robe, and go up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews. And then it says here, and they slapped him on the face. Now, that seems comparatively not as severe as a whipping or a crown of thorns or nails or a spear, admittedly, yes. But it was something about the personalness of a slap across the face. The personalness of a slap from a creation to their creator. And because it's skin on skin, an actual person punching, slapping Jesus across the face, it feels like an even bigger insult. All the way through that gave me a new insight into just how dismissive and disgusting this behaviour is towards Jesus. But yet he is the king, and the power he has is quite remarkable that he could use. And this reminded me of a gentleman I met a number of years ago at a Christian conference. And his name was Daniel Adoti. And his story was that he'd been a bit of a lost soul, really, a bit of a lost cause. And he was brought up in Africa. And in the midst of this kind of really rough background, he'd learned a number of martial arts. That's one of the ways that he'd kind of escaped. And he'd learned them really well. He'd become expert level. And this was a guy who was seriously tough. He was big, he was broad, you wouldn't mess with him. But what happened is he'd come to have a relationship with Jesus, and it was a beautiful story. And more than that, he felt called to tell other people about Jesus as well. So he went and studied at Bible college in London. And while he was there in London, one evening he was out, I think he was returning back to his accommodation. And almost a little bit like the whole Crocodile Dundee image, a mugger comes out with a knife and puts up against Daniel's throat and says, give me your wallet. Now, I know I would probably want to cough up immediately or whatever, but what was really interesting is that as this guy had a knife to Daniel's throat, Daniel, with his training, could have easily disarmed the mugger and at the very least restrained him, but more than likely done some significant damage to him. before the guy even knew what had happened. Before he had a chance to act, Daniel could have disarmed him. Actually, put bluntly, Daniel had the capacity within himself to end that mugger's life without breaking a sweat. But with that knife to his throat and his life under threat, and demands for his wallet, Daniel spoke to the thief in his deep, rich, mellifluous African voice, and he simply said to his attacker, "Do you know the Lord?" And his attacker said, "What? What? And Daniel repeated, "Do you know the Lord?" And in the following moments, everything changed. And Daniel ended up talking to his attacker with gentleness and love about the Lord Jesus. It's an amazing story because he then ended up leading this assailant to the Lord that night. It's a fantastic story, and one that you maybe wouldn't have believed if I hadn't actually spoken to Daniel himself. But it comes to mind when reading this and the rest of the Passion story, because it captures something of that potential horror that Jesus must have experienced at having all this power and ability, and as one children's song says, the ability to melt his enemies' heads in an instant. And yet he didn't. This experience of being slapped by those who he created, this humanity that is the work of his hands, being slapped, punched, whipped, beaten, rejected, molested. It's quite remarkable that all the way through this, through the beatings, through the mocking, through the accusing and saying, "Oh, you are the king," when he really was, all the way to the cross, and as he hung there, as he thirsted, as the water of life, the bringer of the water of life was thirsty and was given some raw wine, he could have at any moment reacted. He could have used his abilities, his resources to devastating effect. Instead, he was silent, as Isaiah said, like a lamb to the slaughter. He didn't react because he was the king. He was the man. He was exactly the image of what God is. Full of love, full of compassion, full of grace. He didn't because the people who punched him, and the people who mocked him, and the people who crowned him with thorns, and the people who drove nails into his wrists and his feet were people that he loved, and people that he came in order to free. He loved the person who punched him, because he knew that that person needed him to not be the king who they thought he could be, power and dominion, but to be the king who took the punishment. So when we see Ecce Homo, here is the man, when we see here is the king, we see the image of God. And as John 1 says, here is God made flesh. Here is the person that the world did not recognize. Here is the person that the world did not receive. Here is the Word who has become flesh and has dwelt among us. This was a power-filled choice. This was not Jesus being a passive victim. This was his choice to experience this, and he experienced it for me, he experienced it for you, and he experienced it for those for whom their job that day was to mock him, beat him. He loved the person whose hand made contact against his cheek. That is the king incognito. With that in mind, I brought this poem to my thinking. It's a poem by Steve Turner, who we've heard from on Sunday mornings a few weeks ago, and it's called The Nail Man. Which one was it that held the nails and then hammered them into place? Did he hit them out of anger or a simple sense of duty? Was it a job that had to be done or a good day's work in the open air? And when they clawed past bone and bit into wood, was it like all the others, or did history shudder a little beneath the head of that hammer? Was he still there, packing away his tools when "it is finished" was uttered to the throng? Or was he at home, washing his hands and getting ready for the night? Will he be among the forgiven on that day of days, his sin having been slain by his own savage spike?